Time next for the business news with Kate Moody. Good evening, Kate.
Hi, Delano.
We have that news out of the United States. Lawmakers giving the green light to that $1.9 trillion stimulus plan.
Yeah, Democrats in the House of Representatives had just enough votes to push through that version of the bill, which was approved by the Senate last weekend. The vote largely along party lines, 220 for, 211 against. The White House saying President Biden will sign the legislation into law on Friday. The plan includes money for state governments, funding for schools and vaccine programs, $1,400 stimulus checks for many Americans, as well as an extension of more generous unemployment benefits for a further 6 months, and a child tax credit for struggling families. Democrats had to remove a proposal to double the minimum wage to $15 per hour, and most Republicans still think it's too expensive, given that the economy is showing signs of recovery. The Biden administration, though, argues it's a crucial step to protecting American households and businesses. Well, let's bring in Gregory Daco, chief US Economist at Oxford Economics in New York. Thanks for being with us on France 24. From your point of view, does this bill target the right points? Will it succeed in protecting households and businesses for the remainder of the COVID crisis?
Well, I would certainly hope so. I would hope that the combination of a healthier situation in the U.S. with the number of COVID cases diminishing and vaccinations increasing alongside this $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan will help lift consumers and businesses out of this very deep recession that we've just been through. As you mentioned, the combination of fiscal transfers to households, increased government spending targeted towards state and local governments, and aid to businesses should all help lift economic activity and build that bridge to a better situation post-pandemic.
So it's described as a relief package, but Nancy Pelosi has said that the legislation could be transformative from the U.S. economy. We know that issues like child poverty are being addressed as they haven't been in generations. Democrats suggesting they want that $300 monthly check per child to become permanent for families that need it. Do you think this is going further than just immediate pandemic relief?
Well, I think in some sense, yes. There is part of this plan that is essentially trying to address the issue of this K-shaped recovery, this issue that some families have been doing relatively well and have, in some cases, not seen tremendous disruptions to their income, have benefited from a very strong stock market. And meanwhile, other families have faced unemployment, reduced hours, reduced wages, which has left their income depressed and have not been able to spend just as they would have, especially in the absence of fiscal aid. So this program not only helps these families at the lower end of the income spectrum, as well as unemployed families, but it also addresses longstanding inequality issues, including, as you mentioned, via the child tax credit. So yes, I think to some extent, this does do more than just relieve the strains from the COVID crisis and addresses the inequality issue. And that's been one of Biden's main point on his political agenda.
Is there a risk, do you think, that this stimulus bill is in fact too much, that it could overheat the economy, which is already showing signs of recovering from its worst contraction in decades?
I don't think so. I think we have to be careful with the term overheating. We are in the midst of a very severe crisis. The economy contracted 3.5% last year. That was the most severe, most rapid decline in economic activity since the World War II demobilization. So a very deep contraction. We're going to come out of it strong with this fiscal stimulus and the improving economic situation and this fiscal stimulus. We should see growth around 7% for the U.S. economy, which would once again become the locomotive at the global level. But I think the risk of overheating is overdone. We are still in an environment that is largely disinflationary. We still have 9.5 million fewer people employed than we had pre-COVID. And so while we will see transitory inflationary pressures over the spring and into the summer, I don't think we're going to be in an environment where inflation spirals out of control.
You mentioned those millions of people still out of work. We know the labor market could take years to really heal, even though the unemployment rate is officially falling. Is that still a relevant measure, do you think?
Well, I think the unemployment rate is a relevant measure, but we have to understand what it tells us. It tells us essentially that we still have a long ways to go in terms of the labor market recovery. We have an unemployment rate that's just above 6%, but we also have a labor force participation rate, which essentially examines how many people are actively looking for a job or employed the people that participate in the labor force, and that has fallen quite dramatically. So what we want to see is both a decline in the number of people that are unemployed, but also people that left the labor force by choice or obligation coming back into the labor force and finding jobs. And that will come via this additional fiscal stimulus, and also, and very importantly, via the ability of a lot of women to come back into the labor market as childcare reemerges and we have healthier solutions and longer standing solutions in terms of education that will support a greater comeback of the labor force participation.
How does the U.S. approach to fiscal stimulus during this pandemic compare to what we've been seeing from European governments?
I think it's much larger. We've seen much more fiscal stimulus coming out of the U.S., especially when you add this American Rescue Plan of $1.9 trillion. In total, we're looking at about stimulus over the past year that accumulates to about 25% of U.S. GDP, which is really unprecedented in terms of not just the size, but also the speed of delivery of this fiscal aid package. So it's much larger than what we've seen in other places around the world. And what's important to keep in mind is that their policy risks are actually tilted to the upside. Biden still has this idea and this desire to pass his Build Back Better plan, which is really geared towards infrastructure spending, climate change, productivity, and research and development. And that would be potentially another $2 trillion over the next 10 years of increased government spending and increased fiscal stimulus. So the potential is actually even greater than what we've seen so far. And again, that would put the U.S. Above other countries in terms of fiscal stimulus from this COVID crisis.
What about the Federal Reserve? Is the time for monetary stimulus past, or could the U.S. central bank have to act again?
Well, that's an open question, but I think what we're seeing is really a rotation towards fiscal policy playing a greater role and monetary policy being a little bit on the back burner in terms of assistance to the overall economy. That's a big shift from what we saw over the decade that came after the financial crisis, where the central banks around the world, the Fed included, really played the central role in stimulating the economy. Today, what we're seeing is a shift towards greater fiscal policy action, greater fiscal stimulus to support the economy. And I think that means that the Fed, in particular, will be able to take more of a back seat in terms of what it needs to do to support the economy. That being said, we don't expect tighter policy anytime soon. We expect the Fed to remain very accommodative with rates close to zero for the foreseeable future, and its quantitative easing program continuing at least through the middle of next year.
Gregory Daco from Oxford Economics, thanks so much for joining us from New York.
Thank you.
Let's check in on the day's trading action now. Wall Street is trending higher, although the tech-heavy Nasdaq has pared back from yesterday's huge gains. It's trading just above the flat line now with less than an hour to go until the closing bell. The Dow Jones did touch a new record high. It's up 1.6% there. The S&P 500 about 0.8%. The major European indices closed mostly higher, just the FTSE 100 in the red in London. The DAX in Frankfurt breached 14,500 points in a new record close. It was boosted in part by sportswear company Adidas, which saw its shares jump nearly 3% as it projected a strong rebound in sales for 2021. That's all from me, Delano. I'll be back in the next hour with the closing bell from Wall Street.
Thank you very much for that, Kate. Fascinating discussion there with your guest on this historic $1.9 trillion rescue package. We don't really know how to quantify how much that is, but
a lot of zeros.
It's a lot of money. Thank you very much for that. It was great, interesting. More news coming up after a quick break. Stay with us. This is France 24.